Hello film fans and welcome to this episode of the Sherlockian. Now, it seems to me that every single time a modern actor is interviewed about playing Dr. Watson in any modern adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, that one of the first things they say is that they've got no interest in playing the old-fashioned view of Watson as this fuddy-duddy, bungling amateur who follows around after Holmes and says, "Oh, however did you discover that, Holmes?" And they always talk about how they're going to go back to the books and adapt the real Dr. Watson as he was portrayed by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in the first place. However, here's what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself had to say about his famous creation in an interview in 1929.
I get letters addressed to him, and I get letters asking for his autograph, get letters addressed to his rather stupid friend, Watson. I've even had ladies writing to say that they'd be very glad to act as his housekeeper.
So, if Conan Doyle himself saw the character as stupid, then are modern actors just wrong? And is there actually any point to Dr. Watson at all? Should he be portrayed as this bungling fool who goes around tripping over his own feet and going, "Oh, however did you discover that, Holmes?" So, in this video, I want to look a bit deeper into the character of Dr. Watson and discover what exactly is the purpose of him in the books and why I believe that he is essential to the stories as we know and love them today. Now, in the Conan Doyle books, Watson serves a very important purpose, as he is, of course, the narrator, and it's through his eyes that we see practically everything. In fact, it's interesting that the first book, A Study in Scarlet, actually starts with Watson on his own, and it gives you a very brief history of his life so far, how he's served as an army doctor, how he's been injured in the leg by a Giselle bullet, and how he's been invalided back to Britain. In fact, Holmes only comes in several pages later, and again, it's through Watson that we see Holmes and discover what an interesting, mysterious person he is. But of course, in films and TV, because it's obviously a visual medium, it's difficult to try and translate this across, and I think that modern adaptations like Elementary and Sherlock in particular do a brilliant job of translating this kind of first-person narrative, if you like, to the screen. In Sherlock, for example, we do follow a very similar pattern to the way the first book starts, with a short flashback of Watson remembering his time as a soldier, then him meeting an old colleague in London, going to the hospital at Bart's, and then running into Holmes, who's there to study bruise patterns in corpses in the morgue. Watson's importance as a narrator shouldn't be underestimated. I know, in the famously brilliant scene which they wonderfully translated from The Sign of Four into the television adaptation of The Copper Beeches in the Granada television adaptations, Holmes has a very low opinion of Watson's literary work and criticises him at length to Watson's chagrin. But in fact, actually, if you compare the majority of the stories written by Watson to the ones written by Holmes, there are two. One of them is The Blanched Soldier and the other one is The Lion's Mane. If you compare them, Watson was actually a far better writer than Holmes. I mean, I know they were both written by Conan Doyle, but if you play along with the fact they were actually written by the people they were supposed to be written by in the stories in the novel, Watson was a much better writer. And it is very interesting that Watson is sometimes typified as this, buffoonish character, when in fact he was actually a very capable and even acclaimed literary author, at least in the context of the stories. Of course, it's through Watson's eyes that we see all of Holmes's deductive genius, and I think that shouldn't be underestimated either. I think it gives Holmes that wonderful hint of mystery that perhaps other pairings of detectives don't always do. I know that other detective authors who came later, well, obviously they acknowledged the debt that they had to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who shouldn't be underestimated. He pretty much created modern detective fiction, particularly the idea of there being a detective pair that solve crimes together. But I know some authors like Dorothy L. Sayers did criticise the idea that is sometimes present in Conan Doyle stories, which is that you don't actually know what Holmes has done. He'll pick some mysterious thing up and we don't know what it is. And Dorothy L. Sayers always said that this was a bit cheating, because how can the reader solve the problem if they don't have all the evidence? The reader should have all the evidence and they should be capable of solving the problem. And then when they fail, obviously, it makes the detective look all the better. And this was something that she really stuck to in her stories with Lord Peter Wimsey in particular. And while I do agree with that, I think that is a perfectly credible way to write detective stories. I do like the way that sometimes we don't really know what Holmes is doing because it makes total sense because you're seeing it through Watson's eyes. And it makes you feel like you were actually there with Watson. And I think this also adds to Holmes's mystique. Holmes is almost a supernatural character in some of the stories. He seems to be able to do things that ordinary men can't, and that makes him all the more mysterious and all the more interesting. And also, I love the ways through the narratives that you really get the idea that Watson craves Holmes's respect. He'd do anything for his friend. And indeed, in that famous scene where Holmes criticises Watson's writing, Watson is genuinely hurt. Not perhaps quite as much as he is in the Granada adaptation, but in The Sign of the Four, he is still quite hurt by Holmes' criticism. And it actually says in his inner monologue that he created the stories entirely for Holmes's benefit, to try and, I don't know, get some credit off Holmes, perhaps, to show his friend to the world. He's proud of his friend. He wants to show him off. Whereas, of course, Holmes couldn't care less what other people think. I really do like that aspect of the stories, the idea that Watson really not only craves Holmes's respect, but likes being associated with him, not from any kind of selfish reason that he wants to gain fame. I know that Holmes always jokes that Watson's his Boswell, but the real Boswell, who was the biographer of Dr. Samuel Johnson, who of course created the first dictionary, the real Boswell was, I think, far more interested in gaining fame for himself by association. By contrast, I don't think Watson is interested in fame at all. I think he just genuinely wants to show off his friend to the world as this incredible figure that he is, and gain Holmes some respect. I think Watson, and some of the best adaptations really show this, it's Watson who really dislikes it when Holmes gets criticised. So, for instance, there is a wonderful scene in one of the Basil Rathbone films. I think it's the Pearl of Death, if I remember rightly. After the famous scene where Holmes is famously miscalculated, turned off a security system to show how bad it is, and then inadvertently caused the pearl to be stolen when a criminal takes his chance in order to bypass the security system, which of course is no longer working. It's actually Watson who is far angrier than Holmes is about the situation. It's him that defends Holmes from Lestrade, who is not unnaturally quite content to joke about the situation after, the barracking he's been getting from Holmes throughout the beginning of the story. But I like the idea that this Watson, as shown in the Basil Rathbone films, is quite content to assault reporters if they criticise Holmes, as he does in one scene, which I quite like. And it shows, again, it's a lovely adaptation of the way that Watson really cares about his friend. And also, through Watson, we see Holmes. And I think that's what makes Holmes, so let's face it, has some quite unpalatable characteristics. He can be quite sardonic, sarcastic. He's, quite untidy. He also, takes morphine and cocaine. In the hands of a less sympathetic writer, you could make him sound really unpleasant if you wanted to. I think it's Watson's genuine regard and respect for his friend, which shines through in the writings, that really makes the reader warm and like Holmes and see him as this amazing, capable person, which otherwise we might not. Now, if you were going to describe the character of Dr. Watson in one word, the word I would choose would be solidity. For me, Watson's chief characteristic is that he's solid and worthy and honourable. Unlike Holmes, who is brilliant and incredible and is a deductive genius, but solid is not perhaps the right word that you'd use to describe him. Steely, maybe, upright, moral, but not solid. He is a man who does clearly have his mental problems. He's a man who's addicted to morphine and cocaine. This is a man who, has sometimes deep bouts of depression and melancholy. A man with sometimes quite rapid mood swings. He's not exactly solid. And I think that is the one characteristic where Watson's that has always really shone out to me. And the best actors who have played Dr. Watson, so people like David Burke or Edward Hardwicke or Nigel Stock, they really encapsulated that solidity in different ways, but always there was that kind of dependableness behind them. Hardwicke in particular I always thought was almost more Holmes's carer, even more than he was his friend. He always seems to be picking Holmes up when he's fallen down, and it's that kind of worthiness which I think really does make Watson an important part of the stories. I think it's interesting, particularly in the Granada adaptions of Sherlock Holmes, that it's Watson, who always takes a leading part in the investigations, but particularly in the interview process. Generally speaking, Jeremy Brett's Sherlock Holmes will take a back seat and occasionally ask a question, but it's Watson who steps forward and talks to the person. It is, personable. He puts them at their ease. He talks to them and makes them feel safe. And it's him that teases out the basics. And then it's Holmes that fits all this together and, solves the problem. They feel like a team. And I think that's how they feel in the books as well. Whatever Conan Doyle himself thought. I mean, clearly, when Conan Doyle called Watson stupid, I think he was probably talking about in relation to Holmes himself. Quite clearly, anybody would appear stupid next to Sherlock Holmes. The man was a genius. I saw a brilliant documentary on Sherlock Holmes. You can find it on YouTube. I think it's called The Great Detective, where they looked at Sherlock Holmes as if he was a real person. And it's absolutely brilliant. And in that show, they calculated that Sherlock Holmes's IQ was probably, like 190, maybe even higher than that. They pointed out that, Dr. Watson appears stupid, but, he's a doctor of medicine. He's a brilliant writer. He's probably got a higher than average IQ. I think average IQ is about 120 or something like that. So anyone higher than that is considered, above average. And most people with a doctorate, are considered, roughly to be about 130 on the IQ scale. So clearly Watson isn't a stupid man, but he is a very, dependable man. There is a brilliant quote that I always love in one of the stories. I think it's the Abbey Grange, and where at the end, Holmes and Watson have got to decide whether to let the police know that they've discovered the murderer who has killed a man entirely in self-defense and possibly even by accident. The man himself is a wife beater, a drunkard, he's not a nice person, and the world is clearly a much better place without him. If they reveal what they know to the police, it will cause a massive scandal involving a titled lady, and they've got to decide what they're going to do. And it's interesting because in that situation, it's Holmes who turns to Watson, and he actually says, "Watson, you are jury in this situation." And he jokingly says that he's never met a man who would be more fitting to be on an English jury. And although that's said, as a joke, I think there is an element of truth in that. I think Watson almost embodies, the archetypal Englishman, if you like. What the English like to think of themselves as being. He's honourable, he's interested in fair play. He might not be, really clever, but, he's not stupid, he's got common sense. Holmes, in a way, is what everyone would like to be. It's what the Victorians aspire to be, purely rational, very clever, scientific, if you like, almost without flaw. But Watson is actually what the Victorians, in Conan Doyle's eyes at any rate, what Conan Doyle saw the Victorian man as actually being, solid, worthy, honourable, dependable. Maybe not very, very clever, but, clever enough, clever enough for his own purposes. And it's this worthiness that I think makes Watson feel like a reliable narrator as well. I think there is a reason why Conan Doyle tells us Watson's life history before he even introduces Holmes. Watson is a doctor, so he is a man of science, essentially. However, he's also an army doctor, so he's clearly very brave, and he also has, the characteristics that the Victorians would associate with soldiering, so he's honourable, he's brave, he's interested in fair play. But, because he's a doctor, he's not a killer, so we don't think of him as being, psychotic, essentially. He's still interested in helping people. But finally, he's also an army doctor, so he's well-travelled. He's been to Afghanistan, which, of course, in Victorian times was, right on the edge of the world. Rudyard Kipling famously set his story, The Man Who Would Be King, in the most northerly part of Afghanistan, a place which seemed, to a Victorian reader, right beyond the edge of the world, a place where they still remembered Alexander the Great, and a man could possibly, make a bid for power simply by, indulging in native superstitions, if you like. So I think Dr. Watson's pretensions as, a medical man who's well-travelled and has been around a bit, that makes him feel like a reliable witness. He's not just any old doctor who's never been out of Bournemouth. He knows what he's doing, he knows what he's talking about, and therefore, when he describes Holmes as this amazing character, we believe him. He's a reliable witness. So Watson's dependability and his background are hugely important to the Conan Doyle stories. And it's this which I think is translated most frequently to the character of Dr. Watson. Essentially, he's the audience surrogate, but he's more than that, because by making him seem a believable and dependable witness, it makes Holmes, who essentially is actually quite an unbelievable character, even though he was actually based on real people to a certain extent, it makes Holmes feel more believable, and we can believe in Holmes. But we believe in Holmes through Watson. Now, the other essential thing about Watson's purpose in the stories, and indeed in many of the adaptations to film and television as well, is that he makes for a capable second pair of hands in solving problems. Now, I think it's fair to say that Watson in the stories is not a particularly good detective. In the few scenes where he does try a bit of deductive stuff, generally speaking, Holmes says, "Oh, admirably done, Watson," and then points out about 7 things that he missed. Indeed, in the story Lady Frances Carfax, Watson gets the complete wrong end of the stick and ends up suspecting the one person of murder who couldn't possibly have done it. Despite this, though, he's very good at the practical side of the problems. In stories like The Copper Beeches, it's Watson who famously shoots the brains out of the giant mastiff that has managed to catch the villain by his throat and is in the process of killing him. In stories like The Empty House, it's Watson's help that allows Holmes to overpower villains as capable as Colonel Sebastian Moran. And indeed, in The Problem of Thor Bridge, Watson actually remarks to Holmes that if it hadn't been for Watson's revolver, Holmes would probably be dead by now. And it's not that Holmes is incapable of defending himself. I mean, we know from the books, and indeed in most of the portrayals of him on TV and films, certainly the modern ones, he is very capable of defending himself. He's an experienced boxer. He's brilliant at single stick, which is a bit like fencing but for gentlemen, so you use a walking stick instead of a fencing saber. But Watson tells us that Holmes is often so wrapped up in the mysteries and the academic side of solving problems that he almost forgets about his own safety, will try and confront a villain simply to find out whether he's right or not, and forget that they might possibly be armed. The other way that Watson is often an integral part of the narrative is through his medical skill. And I've always found it interesting that even an actor like Nigel Bruce, who made Watson far more of a figure of fun, and he portrayed him absolutely brilliantly, those scenes where he's, falling around and falling down the stairs, I mean, I think are actually quite funny, and he was clearly a brilliant comic actor. But I think it's fair to say that Watson in the stories is not quite as clumsy as Bruce portrayed him as. But even Nigel Bruce, in medical scenes, he would suddenly become more professional, and I always loved that about those portrayals. Watson is not a sole figure of fun in the Rathbone films. He does have a professional side. I particularly like the scene, I think it's in The Pearl of Death, where Lestrade suspects a woman, I think it's the housekeeper of one of the murder victims, of being in on the plot, and he says, she won't answer a word when we answer her questions. And Watson just looks at him as if he's an idiot and says, "Well, of course not, man, she's in shock." Leads the woman away, is very gentle and talks to her and says everything's going to be all right. And I always liked that scene because it's Watson that takes the upper hand. And of course he does, because he's a doctor, he knows what he's doing. Again, there's a very similar scene in The Scarlet Claw where Holmes and Watson essentially break into somebody's house to look at a murder victim because the owner of the house, the husband of the murdered woman, won't let them in. And I always like the scene where Holmes turns to Watson and essentially says, "Right, get on with your job. I'll hold him off as long as possible." And the way, again, Watson sort of turns with this kind of, bumbling sort of assistant saying, "Oh, what are we going to do today, Holmes?" into this professional medical man. I always really like that. And I think it's a brilliant part. And it shows just how in-depth those Rathbone films really were and why they're still remembered to this day when, all the other adaptions of Sherlock Holmes essentially became before it, all the silent films. People only really watch those as curiosities. They're not fondly remembered as wonderful adaptions. The other part of Watson's character we haven't really discussed yet is his purpose as a kind of sounding board for Holmes. I know that in the story The Creeping Man, Watson actually talks about the fact that he's essentially part of Holmes's process. That Holmes functions much better by bouncing ideas off of him than he would if he was on his own. And Holmes will ring him up at all times of the day or night to get him to come over to Baker Street in order for him to engage with him because he needs help on a case. And I love the way that Watson doesn't feel at all, irritated by this. He doesn't feel that Holmes is misusing him. He's actually quite pleased to be part of Holmes's process. I like the idea as well that Watson, with his solid self-worth, is a very interesting counterpoint to Holmes. Holmes is a brilliant, deductive, genius-level thinker, but he needs Watson to keep him grounded, Watson to point out what the everyman would think, and indeed, of course, what the reader himself is thinking, to say, but why not this? Why that completely very complicated solution that you just thought up? Why couldn't it be something simpler? It keeps Holmes grounded, and it's a very interesting way of looking at the character. I think the best adaptation of it is almost certainly in Elementary, where they talk about this at length, why Holmes needs Watson around. Johnny Lee Miller's Sherlock Holmes famously says that before he met Watson, he used to talk to a phrenological bust in his study, but it wasn't quite the same, and that now he favours Watson. I also like the fact he talks about how he used to discuss problems with cab drivers and people on buses. I always wonder what they thought. Just anybody, to bounce an idea off. That Holmes is essentially actually quite a social thinker. He needs people around him in order to function at his best. It's very different from the classic way we have of thinking about Holmes as this kind of introvert, this man that, lives in seclusion, just playing his violin and smoking shag tobacco and not needing anybody else to help him at all. He actually does need people to bounce ideas off in order to function properly, just like anybody else would. So in answer to the question that I set at the beginning, what is the point of Dr. Watson? Well, I think he acts as an excellent audience stand-in. We see Holmes through his eyes. And if it wasn't for him, I don't think that Holmes would come across quite as likeable, or indeed as interesting as he would when he's juxtaposed against the solid, worthy, dependable, but essentially quite ordinary Dr. Watson. However, I also think that Holmes and Watson's relationship runs a lot deeper than that. Watson is an integral part of the stories, and the stories simply aren't the same without Watson there. Part of the joy of the stories is essentially the interplay between these two characters that we really like. The parts of the stories I really like are the bits where you see their friendship and the way they interplay with each other, and it's something that the best adaptions of Sherlock Holmes really understand. And it's why things like the Granada adaptions, Sherlock, Elementary, Guy Ritchie's films, why they were so popular. It's not so much because it's Sherlock Holmes solving mysteries, because that's what the audience expects. It's the interplay between these two different characters, and all of those versions that I've mentioned each do the Holmes-Watson relationship slightly differently. I think it's really interesting to look at the two stories in the Sherlock Holmes canon where Watson isn't present, the Blanche Soldier and the Lion's Mane. Now, there's nothing wrong with either of these two stories. They both have very interesting problems, particularly the Lion's Mane, which I was amazed to find out that it's actually a real thing called a Lion's Mane jellyfish. So potentially the incident that happens in the story could happen, though it's very unlikely. But I always dislike those stories. I think they're my least favourite of the entire canon. And the one reason is it's not the stories, it's because there's no Watson. Holmes feels very distant, and we don't get a very human sense of him. It's all told from his perspective, and quite frankly, Holmes is not as good at describing his mysteries as Watson was, and indeed in the Blanche Soldier, which is the first one of the two, Holmes himself actually mentions this, and he realises that actually he was a bit harsh on Watson and his storytelling abilities, because in order to make the story interesting, you do have to hide things from the audience. If you're purely scientific, as Holmes says in The Sign of the Four, the stories aren't very interesting. And yes, a series of lectures might be very instructive, but you're not going to reread them very often, if at all. And I just don't like those stories as much as the ones where Watson is in it, and you really get to see Holmes from outside. The stories feel far more mysterious when Watson is there describing them, when we don't really know what Holmes is up to. And when Holmes is describing everything and the things he sees, it just feels a bit like steps in a puzzle. You sort of think, oh yeah, well, he's discovered that'll mean something later on. It feels far less mysterious, and the mystique of Sherlock Holmes is somehow lessened. So Watson is hugely important to the stories. They just wouldn't be as good without him. And indeed, I think Conan Doyle was a bit harsh in describing him as stupid. Watson is not stupid. He is reliable, solid, dependable, a man of action, very likeable, and the stories just wouldn't be as good without him in them. Anyway, that was the Sherlockian. Thanks for watching, film fans, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.